Let me introduce the panel. I will do that briefly, but you have a more full bio in your program. Jeff Biggers, right to the center here, you just saw his film, is an author, an educator, a journalist, and activist. Along with environmental issues and activism, Jeff writes about cultural and ethnic studies and is closely covering the ban on Mexican American studies in Tucson. Let's hear it for Jeff Biggers. To my far left is Professor Enid Lee. She has received several awards for her work in anti-racism education and community building. She is a teacher, an educator, a researcher, a speaker, and co-editor of Teaching for Change's best-selling book, Beyond Heroes and Holidays. Please, Professor Enid Lee. We also have Professor Khalil Muhammad, is an award-winning author and director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, former history professor, a researcher that examines the link between race and crime. Please, Professor Muhammad, to my left. Thank you, panelists, for being with us this evening. We're going to have a kind of a dialogue up here. I may ask a question or two, but they will take the discussion as they see fit. Let me start, please, though, with this question that Jeff actually posed in the very beginning of his introduction of the film. And that is the question of teaching history. And it is a kind of a difficult thing to do if you teach the truth in history. If we teach true history, we're teaching something about racism, sexism, violence, even genocide. We're teaching stuff that sometimes is very difficult to understand, very difficult to interpret. Do you think our public schools avoid teaching the full and complex history of America because it's too difficult or embarrassing or shameful or hurtful? What are your thoughts about why we don't teach the full complex history of American history? Anybody? Whoever would like to start.
I see they're pointing to me. I have no idea why. I just want to kick this off by saying that a good question to ask of this question is, when we say it is shameful, painful, embarrassing, to whom? Right. For whom? Yeah. Because clearly, the students who every day are experiencing being left out of the curriculum, being marginalized, are in pain. So whenever the question comes up of why aren't we covering this, we need to ask who is suffering as a result of this. And one of the good things is that there are educators who are bold enough to figure out that we need to teach this and are doing it for the benefit of all the children. So the question is, who is it painful for, is what we need to ask when people say it's too painful.
You know, my first panel I ever was on about Arizona history was in 1970. And some of us weren't even born then. And I went on to a panel as a young student in Tucson, and they had three of us. And first stood up someone from the Alton Reservation. He said, first came the Indians, and they had him sit down. And then someone from Southside Tucson gave up, Mexicano, and he said, first, and then came the Spanish and Mexicans, and then he sat down. And then I stood up, and I said, and then we arrived. And the whole conversation was about Anglo history, or outsider history. 40 years later, we're having these same discussions in Tucson about who decides what goes into our textbooks and who is allowed to determine what Arizona history is about. My father showed me when he came back from that panel, he was absolutely humiliated by the discussion. And he took me to the Barrio Histórico of Tucson, where he was working, which had been completely destroyed a year before we arrived in 1970. And he talked about how urban renewal was really another word for urban removal, that they had completely obliterated physically Mexican history from Tucson in order to build hotels and convention center and to take out really what had been remaining. And I see that now is that same process of how they are strip mining and stripping and removing aspects of history and in order to not discuss it. And I think this is what we're dealing with in the schools right now, is what has not only been left out, but what they are intentionally intentionally trying to remove from the curriculum that kids are not allowed to study?
I think what I would add to what we've heard is, which I think are great responses, is that there's a political economy to knowledge in this country. And so the public education systems function as gateways to fueling economic growth. So everything in this country is about growth. And growth basically means extracting profits out of either material resources or human labor. And so for most of this country's history, that meant the enslavement of people, and later it meant the exploitation of those people, and that was a much broader panoply of characters, not to say that whites weren't exploited in the context of slavery. I say all that to say is that the question of whether it's shameful or guilt-inducing is secondary to the point that America's definition of progress in and of itself is economic, and therefore it's counterproductive and it's contrary to the focus on profit to have people questioning the economic order of things. And history, particularly through the lens of the Black experience, demonstrates in a very powerful way the ultimate commodification of human beings in the name of profit. And so history is always a slippery slope once you embrace it as a mechanism for teaching people, because their eyes open up to the privileges